Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a bowl start to finish with Easy Wood tools. Easy Wood tools are a great option for people who are getting into wood turning and don't know where to start. A lot of times people get overwhelmed with tool choices, but with the Easy Wood tools there's only 3 tools that you need and you can do this entire bowl. So I'll show you the tips and tricks that I've learned how to maximize your benefits from using a carbide insert tool, as well as we'll go over some of the pros and cons of these tools as we get through the project. This video was suggested by one of our local customers, and if you have any good ideas or projects you want to see me turn, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, let's crack on this project and turn a bowl. Alright, so the first thing we need to do, I'm going to go ahead and mount my 3-in-1 screw chuck. And the piece I'm turning today, this is an 8-inch bowl blank. This is a nice piece of figured maple. You can see a little bit of curl here on the end. I've got my hole pre-drilled for my screw chuck. And then I've rounded this out so I don't have any square corners on the blank. You want to remove as much material as you can before you put it on the lathe, so you never really want to start out with square blanks, just due to the safety hazard. Go ahead and get my safety glasses on, and I'm going to start my speed at the very bottom end of the range, and then we can go ahead and mount our blank on the 3-in-1 screw chuck. Make sure you hold your hands off to the side so as soon as that seats, it'll take the bowl out of your hands and you're not gripping onto it. From there you can go ahead and lock the spindle and tighten this up. Alright, for the Easy Wood tools, one of the nice things about using these is they're very simple. As far as how to use the tools, we just want to make sure that our cutting edge is on center and then the tool is held nice and flat. So we're going to go ahead and set up our tool rest. Make sure that we're on center, and then I've got my handle nice and flat. While we rough this out, I'll bring up my revolving center for support. You always want to have your tailstock engaged whenever you can, just for safety aspects. So go ahead and lock that tailstock down, tighten up the quill, and then the locking lever. So to start roughing the exterior profile of the bowl, here's the orientation we have on the lathe right now. We're going to go ahead and rough shape the exterior, and then we're going to create a dovetail for our chuck. The tool I want to use for that process is going to be the Easy Rougher. This one has the R4 cutter on it, so it's not a complete square. It's got a slight radius to it. This and the R2 are my favorite cutters for this tool. The full square I don't tend to use as often. So the R4 is a really good cutter. One other thing I want to mention about these is because they have 4 sides, you can mark these with a pencil so you know which side you've used and which sides are dull and sharp. So this one's a brand new cutter on there, so I just have the text facing towards the front of the cutter so I know which one's new. But what I'll do is, because I rotate this in a clockwise orientation, so I'm just going to put a small mark. So I'm going to put a small mark there for number 1, 2 marks there for number 2, and then 3 marks. That way I know when I start rotating my cutter what my orientation is. I'm going to go ahead and turn my lathe on, or give it a quick spin to make sure everything clears the tool rest correctly, and then we can start the lathe speed low, and then we'll bring this up nice and slow. Turning speed for this piece when we're roughing it out, because it's not true right now, I'm going to be 800-900 RPM. And when we start making that cut, make sure that tool is nice and flat. If anything, have the handle slightly higher so the cutting edge is in a more of a trailing position. That way it'll be a little less aggressive for you. But from here, we want to go ahead and true this off, and then we can start rough shaping. You can see as I advanced that tool, I started on the right edge and pushed it to my left. That way I'm cutting into side grain with the front left and front edge of the cutter instead of going straight into end grain and trying to plunge cut this down. I'm starting here on the end, and then I'm just cutting into side grain all the way across. That'll be a little bit easier of a cut because we're cutting side grain, as well as it'll take less wear and tear on the cutter. You can see how easy it is to use these tools. If you're a new turner that's never used a bowl gouge before, the flute and the bevel angle and all the tool handle control can be a little complicated. So these are a really good tool for beginners and guys just getting into wood turning. The other benefit of these too is, for me, I like to have these on hand for really dense woods or acrylics or really hard to cut woods that just take the edge off my standard tools too quickly. So. We want to start removing this and shaping the exterior profile. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my tool rest. And now that the blank is true, we can bump the speed up a little bit and give us a little more of an efficient cut. And you can see as I'm making that cut, I'm cutting on the left front edge of the cutter. If I go straight in, I'm cutting into end grain, and it's going to dull that quicker. Whereas if I'm pushing from the right to left on this leading edge, I'm cutting into side grain, and it'll cut a little easier for me. I want to go ahead and rough mark my diameter of the tenon I need for my chuck jaws. I'm using a 5-inch bowl jaw on a 5.5-inch chuck, so that's roughly where I need to be. The other way you could do this cut is if you wanted to rotate your tool rest perpendicular to the bedways. Then you could come in from here. It just kind of depends on what you like to do. And because this is dry maple, it's going to be fairly dusty. Obviously, I'd be wearing a respirator if we weren't doing the video. So make sure you wear, your proper eye protection and dust protection. Me personally, I like to cut on the side wing. Now I'm going to use the easy detailer to establish my tenon for the chuck. Because it has straight wings on each side, I know I can get a really good detail from, a good dovetail from my chuck. I do want to make sure though that this face is nice and flat, and then this is nice and flat, and then I have a good square shoulder down here for my chuck jaws to register on. It looks like it tapers out just a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and get in there and just cut that a little cleaner. I'm also just going to chamfer that tenon slightly and then true up the exterior. Alright, now I can go ahead and remove some more material to shape this. I'm going to switch hands and rotate that over so I can swing the tool handle around to smooth out my curve. I'm going to remove the tailstock and go ahead and check my fit with my chuck jaws. Make sure that the tenon's not too big or too small. Alright, and that's pretty good. I've got about 1/8 of an inch between the jaws there, so I'm gripping almost on a perfect circle. I could reduce the diameter slightly to give me a little better fit with the chuck jaws. But this is going to be perfect. This will still allow me a large enough foot that when the projects turn and I get rid of the tenon, that my base is stable enough for the bowl. I want to shoot for a foot that's large enough to where when this bowl sits and you put things in it, it doesn't rock and tip over, but not too big to where it doesn't look, aesthetically pleasing. So I think I've got a good diameter of the foot to overall diameter ratio, and I think the shape's pretty good. This is like a Glenn Lucas style shape. And this is the same shape I'm going to shoot for on this piece as well. So my tenon's good here. I'm going to rough shape this just a little bit and try and get rid of some of this tear out, and then just finish up towards the rim and give me a good rough exterior. Alright, I'm going to bring up my tailstock again for support as I finalize my exterior curve, just as an extra safety precaution. I'd rather have it there and not need it than not have it there and have the screw come loose or the piece strip the threads and come off the lathe. So go ahead and bump my speed. I'm going to actually increase the speed a little bit to try and smooth out the exterior. Usually the faster the piece spins, the cleaner of a cut you get. I want to be going fast enough to cut efficiently, but not too fast to where it's dangerous. Right now I'm at about 1200 RPM. That's about the top end for the diameter piece that I'm working. And for my final cuts on the exterior, I want to go nice and slow and be fairly gentle with the cutter and my feed rate. If I advance the cutter too quickly, you're going to tear the fibers out, as well as it's not going to be as smooth. Again, I'm cutting on the left leading edge of the cutter. That way I'm cutting into side grain more so than end grain. Alright, let's check the exterior and see how the surface looks now. So there's still some torn grain from when I was roughing it out, but the rest of the surface is fairly smooth. That'll be good enough so we can go ahead and start doing the interior. So once you have your exterior rough profiled and you have a good tenon for your chuck, we can go ahead and remove this from the screw chuck. And if you don't have a screw chuck, you can always use your regular 4-jaw chuck with the woodworm screw, and you can just use some shims to reduce how deep that screw goes into your piece. The woodworm screws that come with most chucks are like a 2-inch screw, and that's too long for most projects. So you can just get some shim stock and shim it out to where that screw only goes in there, 3/4 of an inch. So I've got the 5-inch bowl jaws on here. This is the set of jaws I use probably 80% of the time. If you don't have a set of bowl jaws that are bigger than the 2.5, highly recommend getting a set. When I see my bowl blank, I want to make sure that I press from the direct center of where I have my screw chuck. That way everything is nice and square. If I'm pushing from one end of the rim or the other, it's going to cock the bowl in the chuck jaws to where it's not going to run true. So make sure you're pushing from the center as you tighten it down, and then go ahead and tighten up both pinion gears a couple of times to equalize the tension you have. Just give that a quick spin. I'm going to set up my tool rest to where my cutting edge is on center. So go ahead and check that. I'd say I'm just a hair below center, so I'm going to bring this up a little bit. There we go. And if anything, I'd rather have the tool be slightly higher to where I can raise the handle and make that cutter less aggressive by making it more of a negative rake. Even though it's not a true negative rake, it just is a little less aggressive if I have the handle slightly above center. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the lathe on to make sure everything clears, everything's spinning true. The piece is held in there nice and secure by the chuck. So I'm going to remove my tailstock and slide that out of the way, and then get rid of my revolving center and retract the quill just to give myself more clearance for my tool handle. When I start roughing this out, I'm going to be roughing it out with the Easy Rougher. This is just the R4 cutter still. I'm going to be stepping it down in small increments at a time. I don't want to take an entire cutter width of a pass to start. That's going to be a little too aggressive. So usually about half a cutter width is what I shoot for. And the same technique applies whether you're using the full size, the mid, or the small Easy Roughers. So start in center and just start peeling this down. The nice thing is we are cutting into side grain right now, so it cuts fairly easy. I'm actually going to bump my speed slightly. Right now I'm about 1300 RPM. Right now I haven't chewed up the exterior of the bowl because as I remove a lot of this bulk in here, the piece is going to move and warp slightly. So I'll chew that up once we get most of the bulk out of the way, and then I'll set my rim and we can finish that area as well. But right now I just want to go ahead and remove most of the material from the inside. Again, that tool handle's nice and flat. If anything, you can have it slightly above center, but if I bring it below center, then it's going to get really grabby and aggressive. So make sure you're at center and level, or you're slightly above center. I'm just stepping this down in increments. The nice thing about the carbide is on dry materials like this, especially once you start getting into mesquite and more of the denser domestic hardwoods as well as the exotics, these carbide cutters cut really well, and they remove material from hardwoods like that with a fair amount of ease, and I don't have to sharpen them. The downside is they do leave a fair amount of tear out because it is a scrape. You're not cutting like you do with a traditional gouge where you're getting a slice. Scrapers do tear out, and that's honestly the biggest drawback of these tools is the amount of tear out you get. I'll show you how to minimize the tear out once we start getting our final cuts and our finished exterior surfaces. And there's a couple little tricks I've learned with the Easy Detailer to shear scrape, and that'll help give us a nice clean surface. Now that I've roughed out a lot of the interior, I'm going to go ahead and set the rim and sand the exterior and get that exactly how I want it, and then we can go ahead and finish the inside as well as the rim. So you can see now if I turn the lathe on, the piece has moved just a hair. It hasn't warped too much or shifted at all, because as you're cutting the bowl, you're removing that structural integrity of the inside as the tree grew, and as you remove that material, the wood starts shifting because there's a lot of tension throughout the piece, and as you're removing that material, now the piece has moved a little bit. Before I set the exterior diameter, I want to go ahead and tighten up my chuck keys slightly. As the wood's in the chuck jaws, the wood does compress over time, so the longer it's in the chuck jaws, you'll need to tighten them up every now and again, especially if you start turning and you walk away from the piece for 15-20 minutes, come back, and there's always going to be some slop in the pinion gears. So make sure you tighten that up because you don't want the piece coming out of the lathe. But I'm going to go and set my exterior profile, and to do that, I'm going to be using the Easy Detailer. What I'm going to be doing is shear scraping like we do with a traditional bowl gouge with an Irish grind. I'll be dropping my handle and shear scraping with that front edge to give me a really clean cut. We're essentially replicating that with the Easy Detailer. It won't cut as clean as a traditional gouge, but we can get pretty darn close, and this will really minimize the amount of time you have to sand. So I'm just going to switch my locking lever so that's out of the way of the tool handle, but I'm going to be dropping that handle significantly so it's really low. I've rotated the tool over so I'm on the top corner of the tool, and then I'm cutting on this top leading edge here. I don't know if you can see that. So we're going to be cutting on this front lead edge and shear scraping this piece. I'm also going to increase my lathe speed slightly. The faster it's turning, the faster or the better it'll give me a cleaner surface. So make sure I'm on my tool rest, rotate the tool over so I'm shear scraping. Let's see if that's doing anything. Yeah, you can see on the overhead, so this area, I'll mark it with a pencil, I'm going to outline it so you can see it better. So in between these lines is where I was shear scraping. You can see it leaves a really good surface. And then this is where it was just off the easy rougher. So we got a lot of tear out, and now we're cutting through that tear out and minimizing that, which will then give you a better surface and you won't have to spend as much time sanding. If you start going and it's catching on your tool rest a little bit, and it's not giving you a smooth pass across your tool rest, grab some wax and just run it across the top of your tool rest. That'll help that tool glide a little easier and give you a smoother surface. Got some nicks in my tool rest that keep catching on me. My tool handle's running out of room to move, so I'm going to rotate my rest. I'm just working that tool back and forth, trying to smooth out the surface. I don't want to be putting too much pressure on the piece because you can hear that tool rubbing a little bit. Let's take a look and see if we've reduced some of that tear out we had. So you can see the tear out's about almost gone now. It's a lot cleaner than the area we haven't cut yet. So I'm just going to keep smoothing that out and trying to get rid of that tear out as much as possible. A little bit of chatter because that cutter is kind of high off the tool rest. All right, let's see how it looks now. I can feel it's already a lot better. There is still a little bit of tear out there, and we've got some on the rim, but we will be reducing that when we get our rim profile, so I'm not worried about the tear out here. I do want to smooth this out a little bit better so I don't have to sand with such a coarse grit to start. All right, that's giving me a lot better surface. Now I'm gonna go ahead and finish the inside, roughing it out, and then I'm gonna establish my rim. I'm gonna drop the speed back down just a little bit now that I'm not shear scraping. I'm going to establish my rim diameter. I think that'll give me a good looking rim, still leave a nice open bowl. And you can see I've got my hand here blocking the chips. We do sell a chip deflector for the tool. I find that it gets in the way a little bit. It is handy, but it does kind of get in the way when I start rotating the tool, trying to shear scrape as well. So I just kind of block it with my hands. I want to establish my rim now. Before I finish that, I want to talk about rim design for a second. I want the highest point of the rim to be on the exterior and then have it taper down towards the center. Every bowl that you pick up, you should have the rim starting at the high point on the outside and then roll towards the center. Anytime that you have that rolling away from the center, it just kind of feels cheap and people pick it up, and that's the first thing they do. Anytime, if you ever sell a bowl and they pick it up, they're always going to rub the rim of that to see how it feels. It's just kind of an unconscious thing, but if it rolls away, they immediately set it down and pick up a different piece because they don't like the way it feels. So aesthetically, it also looks better to have that rolling towards the center as well. So I'm going to have a slightly radiused rim here on the outside edge, Glenn Lucas style. I really like his bowl design. It's one of the best aesthetically looking bowls as well as the utilitarian function. So that's the style I'm going to shoot for. So I want to make sure that this rolls towards the inside. My tool rest is in the way a little bit and I can't get it off the lathe because I don't have a swing away. But what I can do is raise my tool handle enough just to clear the tailstock. And I'm shooting for about 1/8 of an inch drop from the outside towards the inside. So I'm really happy with that shape. You can stop the lathe, take a look at it, and give it a quick feel to see. I think I'm going to radius that just a little bit more on the inside. And what I can do as well is I can shear scrape with that easy detailer from here. So I've got the tool angled against my hip. I've got the handle dropped down. I'm not on level anymore. And now I'm cutting on this front edge right here. I can only work about half the radius of the rim before I have to move my tool rest. But we can see just how much better of a surface I get when I shear scrape with that tool as opposed to just straight scraping with it. So I'm very happy with that rim now. We'll be radiusing this over in just a minute. As far as the interior design, I do want to have that inside of the bowl slightly undercut from the rim, so it's going to be undercut here and then have a nice flowing transition to the inside that'll match the exterior curve. I'm going to use that easy rougher to radius the rim of the bowl slightly. And I'm being very gentle here. I don't want to get too crazy with it. But I'm just swinging that tool handle to give me the radius I'm looking for. Switch sides so I can get the tool handle motion I need. And that looks nice now. Okay, let's go ahead and finish the interior, roughing it out. Adjust my tool rest back in, and I've slightly angled it towards the center so I can make sure that cutter is supported as much as possible. If I left that nice and square to the front of the bowl, I'd be over the tool rest a couple inches. Now I'm only over the rest an inch or so. I feel like the tool rest is just a little high, so I'm going to drop it. We'll stop the lathe and check my depth for a second. I think we've still got a lot of material to remove. Yeah, another inch or so. But you always want to stop and check just to make sure you don't overshoot it and then turn out with a funnel. And while I still have a fair amount of material in here, I want to go ahead and undercut and set that rim. So I'm going to switch over to my easy finisher. This is the round cutter. This will allow me to get in there and undercut that rim. And this will give me the nice catch that I'm always looking for. Let me show you guys what happened. So I got a little too aggressive pushing into the wall of the bowl. And because I was hitting end grain, it got really grabby and just tore that out. So as I'm undercutting this, I want to be fairly aggressive because I'm kind of pushing into the end grain. So just be careful there. The finisher though with the round cutter allows me to get the nice sweeping curves I want on the interior. Let's check and see how the undercut looks. Okay, the rim feels really good as far as the shape goes. And I've got the nice undercut. That's going to give me a nice wall thickness, and now we can go ahead and start getting our final interior profile. So I'm really happy with the rim profile and the radius we have here. The undercut is nice and where I want it to be. So now I'm going to go ahead and start roughing the interior shape. I'm actually going to switch back to the rougher just to get rid of some of the bulk. There's a reason they call these the finisher and the rougher. Obviously the cutter shapes are different, but this one is just hogging material out of the way and not going for a final finish cut or a finished surface. Then we'll switch to the round cutter to get that surface we need. So you don't want to go and dole up your round cutter roughing this out as much as possible. So use the rougher to get rid of all the waste material you're getting rid of, and then we'll come back through with the round finisher and smooth it out. The one nice thing with these tools is you don't have to have a sharpening system, so it removes a lot of that initial cost when you start wood turning. So, and a lot of guys, you know, if you live in an apartment or you have a really small shop and you just don't want to have a grinder, these are a good way to get started as well. So I've roughly got about, I'd say just under a ½ inch of material I want to remove before I'm at the base. And let's go ahead and establish my final depth. Right now I'm not looking for a clean cut, I'm just trying to get rid of material so I can come in with my rough or my finisher and then smooth this all out. The chip deflector actually would probably come in pretty handy, just getting rid of that material, just so it's not flying all over your shop and making a huge mess. But I'm going to go ahead and adjust my tool rest in for some more support. Now I'm going to switch over to my finisher and get that nice smooth flowing curve on the interior that I'm shooting for. Once the bowl's finished, if there's any flat spots in the curve or any ridges, the finish makes it show up. So you want as smooth as a surface as possible. So we've got a nice smooth rim, tapering towards the inside, that undercut, and then a nice flowing transition. I'm just using the cutter to try and remove some of the shaving so I can see where I'm at. If you have a set of calipers, go ahead and check your wall thickness. I have just kind of a rough idea of where I'm at. I'm probably, 5/8 thick on the walls, so there's quite a bit of material I'm going to remove here just to thin the bowl out overall. But I'm pretty happy with how the shape's coming along. Rim, really happy with that, and then we'll go ahead and get this all finished out. Remember on one of our last videos we talked about making sure your arm is over the tool handle. That way if it does get grabby, your arm's there to stop it. You definitely want to do that on these tools because they are going to be more aggressive than a negative rake scraper. So make sure your hand is over your arm is over the tool handle. Going to check my wall thickness here and just trying to go for a feel of how the curve is. I want to match the exterior and the interior curves to where I have uniform wall thickness throughout the piece. Obviously it's going to be thicker at the rim just because of the rim, but we get that undercut in there to try and remove some of the bulk. But that feels pretty good. It's still a fair amount of material. I want to lighten the bowl up a little bit. I like to clean the cutter off just so I can see where my cutting edge is. I'm just feeling for any ridges or anything in there that are going to be hard to sand out and that need to be smoothed out with a tool. So I've got a little bit of a ridge right there. Otherwise the surface feels pretty smooth. So because these are a scraper, we aren't going to get as clean of a surface as we will with a bowl gouge. That's just part of the way these tools are. They are a scraper, they're not a bowl gouge. So now that we're pretty close to our final size, let's double check our depth. All right, and with the tenon, because we will be incorporating the tenon into our shape, I've got probably 5/8. We're right about here right now. So with the tenon in there, we've got plenty of room to reduce the tenon as well. So I don't want to go any deeper than this because I might have to remove some of the tenon. So I'm just giving myself some room to work. But now that we have our depth and our curve finalized for the most part, I feel like there's a little bit of a ridge here I can smooth out. I'll show you how to minimize tear out on the inside as well. I'm going to do a couple more passes here just to smooth this out. For you guys, you might find starting from the outside and pushing towards the center is smoother or easier to control. Some of you guys might find starting from the center and pulling it towards you is easier to control. So find which works best for you. I find if I start from the inside, it's a little more controllable as far as smoothing my curves out. Obviously from here I have to start from kind of the outside and go towards the rim, but find out what, feel what works best for you. Okay, I'm really happy with that curve. The inside feels nice and smooth, got a nice smooth radius. There's not a bunch of ridges or anything in there that's too bad. But if I get rid of the tool rest, you can see the tear out on the end grain. So we got end grain here, and then we have end grain here, and there's some tear out. So to minimize that, what we'll do is I'll put my tool rest back in. We're gonna bump the speed up to give ourselves more efficient cut, as well as I'm gonna rotate the tool 45 degrees. So the tool is rotated on 45 degrees, and this is gonna be more of a slicing cut or more of a shear scrape. It's not going to be a true shear scrape just because there's not a burr on carbide, but it should give us a smoother surface, as well as one thing you can do is put some paste wax into the wood fibers to help support them as they're cut, so they cut cleanly instead of tearing out. What I'm using is just Yorkshire grit. This is Easy Wood Tools product they just came out with. Yorkshire grit's been on the market for a while, and it's a really good product. Very similar to Scratch Free. It's food safe, non-toxic. Basically, it's like a triple equivalent, but it's food safe. So I'm just going to put a bunch of the wax in the end grain fibers to help stiffen them up so we can cut them cleanly. The side grain fibers are cutting clean already, so I don't need to waste wax and putting it on the side grain. I'm going to put some down in the bottom there just to help me smooth that out a little bit. But now there's wax in the wood fibers, so there's wax and oil in this, paste wax. Those will help stiffen up the fibers enough to where we should be able to get a clean cut. One other thing too is now that I've been cutting on the front edge of this cutter, I'm going to rotate it around to a fresh edge. That way I'm cutting on a very, very sharp edge. So just loosen that up a little bit, and then I can rotate that cutter around and then lock it down. The other thing too with these Easy Wood tools, you don't have to get crazy with how tight you get the screw, just finger tight. We get a fair amount of tools actually that we have to remove the screws from because they strip out, because guys will just crank down on these. So you don't need to get too tight on the screw of the cutter. Just snug is all you need. Now that we have paste wax in here, we're going to shear scrape, so the tool is going to be on a 45-degree axis here. That'll give us a little bit cleaner cut, as well as we're going to bump the speed up. We were turning at about 1300 RPM. I'm going to bump the speed up to 1600. It's about as fast as I want to go on this piece. Obviously, if that's a little too fast for what you feel comfortable with, just stay at your standard turning speed. But now I've got the tool nice and flat on a 45 degree. I actually need to drop the tool rest just a hair, because now that I've rotated it up, it's a little bit taller. I'm going to start in the center, work towards the rim, and try and be as smooth as possible on your feed rate. And now the tool handle or the tool's getting in the way of the rim, so I'm going to rotate that over and pick up the cut. Right here you can see the mark where I stopped the cut. I'm going to pick it up there. Again, tool on a 45. The other nice thing too with putting wax in the wood fibers is it's not as dusty when you're trying to cut it. Okay, so there's still just a little bit of tear out. It's definitely reducing it. The bottom here looks nice and clean, so I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start the cut right about here and then work towards the rim. Tool on a 45. Pick that up again. Depending on how deep your tear out goes, you might have to do a fair amount of passes to get through that tear out. Now I'm just picking up below that line I had, that pencil line, and now I'm just blending those two cuts. I had the lower bowl cut and then I had the upper rim cut, and now I'm just kind of blending those two curves together. But you can see we're getting a little bit better of a ribbon than we were before with the scrape. We should be getting a pretty clean surface. Alright, you can see there we've minimized that tear out a lot compared to how it was before. So that's actually a really good surface for these tools. So now we're ready to go ahead and sand the upper half of the bowl here, and then we'll sand the interior and the rim as well, and then we'll be able to flip this around and finish the foot. This is going to get really dusty because it's dry material. So obviously wear a dust mask if you can. I'm going to be using a drill with a 2-inch disc holder with a 180 to start. And when I'm sanding with the drill, I want to drop the speed down. About 700 RPM here. If you go any faster than that, it doesn't cut efficiently, and it'll probably heat check your wood as well. So I'm going to sand the exterior profile. I've got my drill low and I'm sanding on the bottom half of the pad. If I sand on the top half of the pad, it's going to pull my paper off and it's going to kick the drill down and catch on you. So make sure you're always sanding on the bottom half of the disc. Go and sand the rim. Just trying to smooth that out and give myself a nice flowing radius. And then when I sand on the inside of the bowl, I'm going to be sanding on the back side of the bowl where it's coming up at me. Also want to make sure that the disc is centered on the holder so I don't ruin the Velcro. And now because I'm sanding when it's coming up, I'm on the top edge of the disc as opposed to the bottom edge on the exterior. Because we had wax on the surface, it does clog the pads pretty quick. So I'm going to switch to a fresh disc. Okay, the bottom to about here is nice and smooth, and then I've got a small ridge I need to sand out. The rest of that feels pretty smooth though. So use that drill to contour the inside and get this profile you want and get rid of all those ridges. I've still got some tear out, a little bit of tear out right there. I'll spot sand in a second, but I need to smooth out a little bit of this rim here. I've got a nice flowing curve till about right here, and then there's a little bit of a ridge, so we'll smooth that out. There's a little bit of that wax in the sanding pad still. It's kind of clogging up the grit. I don't have a disc cleaner in here, otherwise I'd hit those discs on a cleaner and then they'd be a fresh disc again and I keep using them, but I'll save those for later. I can reuse them. Alright, let's go ahead and make sure we got rid of all of our torn grain. Just grab a rag to wipe that out and you can see your end grain fibers. If you do have tear out, you can lock your spindle and then spot sand. You can spot sand those trouble areas to get rid of your torn grain. So I'm pretty happy with that. It's nice and smooth now. We can go ahead and get our next grit on. So we went from 180, we're gonna go to 220. We'll do 220, 320, and then up to 400. And what you're looking to do as you go through the different grits is you're looking to get rid of the sanding scratches from the previous grits. You can see the amount of dust we're getting off this piece. Obviously wear a respirator when possible. So I've sanded the exterior, I've sanded the rim, now I'm going to blend the exterior of the rim radius. Let's stop the lathe and make sure we're getting rid of our tool marks and our sanding grit marks. I've got a little bit of tear out here I need to spot sand. I should have checked that when I was on the 180 grit. Okay, that's good. There's still some scratches right here from my 180. So I'm going to hit that inside rim here. Now we're going to go up to our 320. A lot of times you get debris on the hook and loop on your pads. Make sure you clean those off occasionally, because if you have a bunch of shavings on there, it's not going to stick very well. So now that we're at 320, we're going to start seeing the curl appear if there's any figure in the piece. It's going to start popping out better because we're getting better light through the piece because the surface is getting refined. You should be able to feel this, and if you have any ridges, go back to your 180 and sand them out. Make sure you do the hand test, right? If you can feel it when it's on the lathe spinning, people will be able to feel that when they pick it up on a table that you're trying to sell it. So make sure that it feels nice and smooth in the hand while it's spinning. That'll usually magnify any issues if there are. So Make sure you take the time and sand the rim very well, because that's the first thing people feel when they pick up the piece. I can't tell you how many bowls I've seen at craft shows where guys were selling them and the bowl was 99% really well done, but you go to pick it up and then the rim just had some flaw in it, or there was a big piece of tear out, and it was like if you just spent 2 more minutes getting rid of that little flaw, the piece would have been really, really nice. So I'm just feeling this to make sure I've got a smooth radius between the exterior and the interior rim. The curve's nice. The inside rim here is nice and crisp, but it's not sharp. I can sit here and keep my fingers on that without it cutting me, but it gives me a nice transition between the rim and the interior. So that's what I'm shooting for there. I'm gonna go up to my last grit, 400, 600, whatever you wanna go up to. If you wanna go even higher, go for it. Again, I'm on the bottom edge of the disc. If I try to sand on the top edge, it's going to flip the paper off, or it's going to catch the drill and rock it out of your hand. So right now, the 600 grit is more of almost a burnishing pad, really, than a sandpaper. It removes so little material, the 600 grit. It's really just kind of burnishing the fibers. But it does leave a really good surface. So for the extra couple of minutes it takes, I'd definitely do it. The last thing I'll use as far as the abrasives go is this is just some Merlon non-woven, basically like a scuff pad. This is 2500 grit, and I'm just going to burnish the surface a little bit more and try and refine that a little better. Alright, so from here I'm going to go on to the Yorkshire grit. Yorkshire grit is available in the original. This is very similar to Scratch Free. It doesn't have as much abrasive compound in it as Scratch Free, so I prefer the Scratch Free better for this one. But their microfine is a next step up from Scratch Free, and the original it's a lot finer and it leaves an amazing surface. This is probably my favorite new go-to finish after Scratch Free. It really bridges the gap between the original and Scratch Free, and then the micro magic we carry. So this is good for, you know, stabilized wood, really dense hardwoods. This leaves a super good surface, and I'll show you once we put it on this piece, you'll be blown away about how good it looks. So before we put this on, I want to give it one more inspection to make sure there's no sanding scratches that still need to come out, because I don't want to sand with paste wax on there. It just loads up the paper too quickly. I can see some scratches in there, so I'm going to spot sand those with the 600. And then there's a little bit of a tear out or something right here I'm going to hit with the 600. So before I put my finish on, I'm looking for scratch marks. When the bowl's dry and there's no finish on there, they kind of hide in the piece a little bit better, and you don't notice them. But as soon as you put a finish on there, you can see those deep scratch marks. So make sure you give the bowl a nice thorough inspection on the rim and the exterior and the inside as well. So I'm going to apply the original Yorkshire grit now. So turn the lathe on. I'm going to bump my speed back up to my turning speed, about 1300 RPM. And then get a rag and put on a generous amount. And I'm putting a fair amount of friction on here. A lot of pressure, because I want that grit to refine that surface even more. If it gets too hot to keep your hand there, that's too much pressure. I'm going to just throw my paper away. You want to have enough pressure towards melting the wax and abrading the surface, but not too hot to where you can't hold it still. And put on a liberal amount. You don't want to cheap out on this stuff. Make sure you get enough on there to actually improve the surface. A lot of times people put just a tiny bit on there and it's not enough to actually be beneficial. So You can see the surface of the bowl is looking better. We're getting a little bit more gloss. It's enhancing the natural color of the wood. And the beeswax in the mixture is a really good smell. I love the smell of beeswax. So once I've buffed it, I'm going to get a clean side of my rag and remove as much of that as possible now, because we'll be going on to our finer grit. The white jar, the microfine, this stuff is incredible. Just wait till you see the surface we get off this polish. This stuff gives you a perfect base for your final finish, and it just enhances the natural surface of the wood so much. Like, honestly, I'm not going to try and promote something that I don't believe in. And this stuff, I absolutely love this stuff. So now that we've polished this, I'm going to stop the lathe and show you the surface quality we get. So the figure jumps out now. You can see the chatoyancy we have in the piece. Everything is just buttery smooth, really, really smooth velvet surface. And the interior of that bowl is done. So, love the microfine stuff. Alright, so now that the interior, the rim, and most of the exterior is done, I'm going to take this out of the chuck and we're going to put it in a Longworth chuck. That's going to be our reverse chucking method on this piece. You could do a jam chuck, you could do a friction drive if you wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and use the Longworth chuck because I haven't really used it much, but I've been playing around with it a little bit and I like it. So that's going to be my go-to reverse chucking method on this piece. But yeah, the interior of that microfine really makes that chatoyancy pop. So it doesn't have a lot of figure in this piece, but you can see what figure it does have really stands out now. Really like the rim profile, nice and smooth. This one's got more of a sharper edge on it, which I think looks good, but it's not as comfortable in the hand as having the slightly rolled edge. So play around with the design a little bit, see what you like. But the nice thing is with these tools, you're focusing more on the design of the bowl instead of how to use your tools. Which for me, I don't really care how I get to a finished product so much as how the finished product ends up. I'd rather have a bowl that looks amazing that I used, scraping tools with than having focusing on a perfectly clean cut and then turning out with a funnel or a weird shaped bowl. So I know the purists will argue with me, but to each their own. I'd rather be successful by any means than be unsuccessful and have perfect tool control, I guess. So as far as using the Longworth chuck, this is a 10-inch version. My bowl's 8 inches, so it'll fit no problem. Best way to center this up is lay the bowl down into the Longworth chuck and then tension the sliders to where all the grippers are touching your bowl. And then just snug these up a little bit to where there's some tension on each gripper. Yeah, so what I'm shooting for right now is just finger tight while I get this fairly secure. And then we can go ahead and mount this on the lathe, and then we'll alternate tightening the grippers up and getting our final fit on the grippers. So now that the piece is in here and it's secure, go ahead and turn these or tighten these up. Alternate them in a star pattern like you do when you're tightening your lug nuts. As best you can, that way it evens out the pressure on each gripper. Because if you tighten them all up really tight on one side and the other side's loose, it's going to push your bowl off the center. So before I get those completely tight, I'm going to bring up my revolving center and just make sure that the piece stays on center as I'm tightening these up. Alright, so once you have these all alternated and tightened down, I'm just going as tight as I can go by hand. I'm not using an Allen key because you'll over torque these grippers and you'll push the bowl off of center. So You just need to go nice and snug with your hand tight. Obviously, this chuck isn't going to be as secure as an MDF jam chuck, so we want to be fairly delicate when we make our cuts here. But right now, we're going to go ahead and rough our exterior profile now, get rid of the bulk of the base. We'll also smooth this out, and then we're going to incorporate that tenon into our final foot. So we'll give it a nice little radius here, and then we'll do a slight undercut on the bottom as well. What I'm going to do, loosen up my tailstock quill, loosen up the tailstock, and then I'm going to advance this out so I can give myself more clearance. A lot of times when that tailstock is all the way up here, there's not a lot of room to move that tool handle around. So extend that out and make sure everything's tight again. One little tip, if you don't have a lot of material in the base of your bowl and you're fairly close to your final diameter and you're worried about leaving a dimple from your revolving center, one thing that you can do is you can either go to a cup center, which will still leave a center point, or you can go to your 60-degree cone, and then what I've done here is just gotten my ring turning chuck bushing. This is just off the ring turning chuck, but I've put some tape on here. That'll contact the wood side, and then I'll slip this over my revolving center, and this will spread out the load of the revolving center across the entire surface area of that bushing, and it won't leave a center point. So if you're concerned about the center point, you can support it this way. The reason I have the tape on there is just so the aluminum doesn't discolor the wood. But not tight, not super tight with the tailstock, just snug the quill down, and then we can go ahead and set up our tool rest. Again, with the tool thickness, we want that cutting edge to be right on center, which is right where we're at. And for the rest of this process, we'll be using the easy finisher and then some of the detailer to shear scrape a little bit. But go ahead and make sure that clears. And I'm going to start the lathe speed slow because I'm using the Longworth Chuck, and then I'm going to bump it up a little bit. While we're using the Longworth Chuck, the turning speed has to be reduced. You can't turn this at 1400 RPM. I believe these have a limit at 500 RPMs. So, follow the manufacturer's recommendation on their max speed for these. If you turn it too fast, it could get dangerous, so just be careful with that. But now I want to incorporate the tenon into our foot design as well as removing the bulk here. And I'm being fairly delicate with my cuts. If I get too aggressive, it could cause that bolt to shift inside those grippers and come out. So right now I'm looking at my horizon line to make sure that curve is transitioning well between the surface we finished and the surface we're turning. I want to blend those two as much as possible and give ourselves a really clean exterior radius. I'm going to stand back and just look at my horizon line. I need to blend this surface just a little bit. All right, I'm happy with that curve. I think there's just a little bit of a high spot here. Let's try and blend those out. All right, now I'm going to try and shear scrape as much as I can with my detailer. This time, before I adjust my tool rest, I want to stop the lathe and make sure I'm not going to hit my Longworth Chuck, because it'll hit these grippers and it'll snap them off. So make sure you stop the lathe now if you're adjusting your tool rest. Make sure it clears. And then we're going to shear scrape. So I've got the handle low. I'm cutting on that lead edge. We're trying to just smooth that surface and get rid of any tear out that we might have. Okay. And I can't get my tool handle far enough over because of the tool rest, or sorry, the tailstock in the way. But what I'll do is I'll get my finisher and rotate that on a 45 and try and mimic that shear scrape. Tool handle's hitting the tailstock, so go as far as you can, and then you can rotate back over and cut this direction. Alright, so that's about as good as we're going to get as far as a cut. But I'm going to establish my foot now. I'm going to use the long point of the detailer. I'm going to go back to my rougher now. Just clean up the surface. You want to be very gentle with the cuts you're making right now. Try and shear scrape this to reduce the amount of pressure on the wood. We have two things going against us right now. We have a very slow, inefficient turning speed combined with a scrape. So it's going to be putting a lot more pressure on the wood while it's in the chuck jaws, as well as it's not going to give us as clean of a surface just because we've got two things working against us. So before I get my foot finalized and I remove the tailstock and finish this up, I want to sand the exterior while it's still supported and blend and finish the exterior here. So I'm going to remove that the tool rest now. So trailing here, bottom edge of the disc holder, making sure I'm not going to hit my grippers. And I don't need to reduce the turning speed because we're already really slow. Make sure your disc holder is sanding the opposite direction of your bowl, or else it'll try and overspin the motor on the drill and it makes a terrible noise. Let's check our tear out and see how we are. Okay, we've blended this surface really well. There is a strip of tear out right here. I'll probably have to spot sand that. And then there's a bit of tear out right here on the foot. Okay, we're almost done with the tear out there. I've got a fair amount of tear out right here. So I'm going to spot sand for a second. Try and feather that drill across the surface to try and blend that. If you sit there and just sand in one spot, you're going to create a small little divot. So you always want to be feathering that drill back and forth. Okay, we got rid of the tear out here. Now there's just a little bit of tear out right there. So instead of sanding that out, I'm going to actually get some of the Yorkshire grit and put that in the end grain fibers and see if we can just do one cut on there and clean that up. Because I'm not really happy with the surface that's leaving us. And I'll bump the speed up just a tiny bit, see if we can cut this clean. I'm going to shear scrape it as well, so I've got that tool on a 45. All right, still got a little bit to remove. Okay, that actually helped a fair amount. Let's go ahead and sand that out now. I'm gonna get a new disc as well, that'll probably help. I'll have to do. Okay, that cleaned that up really well actually. Really happy with that. So we got rid of all of our torn grain. We've blended our two curves now. Really happy with the exterior profile. All we need to do is turn the foot and then sand and finish this exterior piece, and then this bowl will be done. So the nice thing with these tools is I can go with obviously a dry blank. I can go start to finish with 3 tools. A couple little tips as far as getting rid of the tear out and minimizing that. Will save you a bunch of time. But let's go ahead and sand this now with our 220. Go ahead and bump that up to our 320. Making sure that disc is in the trailing position. Now we'll bump up to our final grit. The reason I'm sanding this all now, instead of turning the foot and then sanding the entire exterior, is I'm sanding with a fair amount of pressure on the bowl, and I want to make sure that it's as supported as possible while I do that. If you were doing this production style, it wouldn't make sense to do it because it's going to take more time to do that as you're then swapping grits more and then moving, you're obviously moving a lot of things out of the way to sand. So for production turners, doing that's probably not going to apply, but for this piece in these jaws, that's what I need to do to make sure I can sand it well enough. So I've got a little bit of sanding scratches right there. I'm actually going to drop back down to my 320 and hit that one more time. Had some marks left over from my 220. Just want to make sure I get those out before I move on. then I'll hit this with my non-woven pad. And then I'm not going to do the Yorkshire grit just yet. I'm going to remove my tailstock and finish cutting the inside of that recess. Now that I'm unsupported, I want to be very gentle with my cuts and my tool technique here. One thing you can do is you can switch to the negative rate cutters, because those will be less aggressive, more of a trailing cut. They won't tend to self-feed, so you can switch to that. That's probably what I'd recommend doing, or we can go ahead and try and shear scrape this as well. If this was a denser piece of wood, I'd switch to the negative rake. If this was like an exotic, like a bobinga, or cocobolo, or something denser like that, I'd definitely go negative rake, because that self-feeds into that hard material so much worse than a soft maple or a hard maple like this. A hard maple is nowhere near as hard as one of those exotics. So on this material, I can get away with just shear scraping with a regular cutter. As far as my bowl design and my thickness, when I turned the inside, I left myself that ½ inch of room to where I could reduce that tenon, as well as give me a slight undercut here without being too thin in the bottom. If you start turning this and you're tapping it and you can hear a really thin sound, you're probably too thin. So when you're doing the interior, make sure you're using calipers and checking your bowl thickness as well. But I knew I had the material I needed there for this piece. If you're in these jaws and you're putting too much pressure, you'll be able to hear it. It'll start making a chattering noise. You hear that? That's too much pressure. That's the sound it makes right before the piece pops out of your chuck on you. So when you're doing this and you don't have a very secure hold, make sure you're listening for sounds. If the piece is flexing a lot or making a lot of noise, or if you're too thin, the bottom will be flexing and start chattering really bad, you'll know something's not right. So make sure you're listening for those those cues of what the piece is telling you. Because that wood will let you know when it doesn't like what's happening to it. Alright, so to give myself a nice flat base here, I'm going to switch to my detailer because it's got a really long wing. I can use that basically as a straight edge to smooth that out. And then to get into this corner, I'm actually going to flip the tool handle on the far side of the lathe. So that allows me to cut into the corner from the front edge, and then I can come in here and cut that corner there. Alright, let's stop the lathe and take a look. So now we've got this slightly undercut here. Got a little bit of a high spot in the center. I'm going to remove some more material just to make sure I'm going to clear. If this is the lowest point in the bowl and it's going to contact the table there, it'll rock on you. So I want to make sure that the bowl is sitting on the outside rim. So this is slightly concave towards the center. If I hold my pen up there, you can see it's tapering towards the center. I need to remove a little more material here, and then we can go ahead and sand the base and then throw our Yorkshire grit on there. Let me try and shear scrape that a little bit. Just testing to see if I can shear scrape this as well on the base. I'm hitting the tool right there. You can see that black mark. Need to clean that up, so I'm going to shear scrape with my finisher. Okay, let's go ahead and sand and finish this. I'm going to remove my tool rest. Don't want that in the way of my drill. Switch to my 220. And then on to my 320. On to my next grit on the paper. Hit that corner. If you want a crisper corner in there, there's a different cutter you can get for the detailer that's a little more of a fine point instead of the radius tip. Stop the lathe and take a look. Definitely got a mark right here on the rim I need to sand out. A little bit of marks from the sanding disc. Alright, I'm going to hit this with my non-woven pad. Alright, now it's time to go on to our Yorkshire grit. So now that I'm blending our finished surface at the rim to the area that we turned in sand on the exterior, I want to be very careful of where my fingers are in relationship to the grippers. I don't want to be hitting those with my knuckles if I can avoid it. So I'm looking at the shadow line of those grippers, or where the top of the Allen key is, or the Allen head is, coming around so I don't jam my fingers into those. And I want to get enough pressure on there to actually enhance the surface and not just glide across it. I want that abrasive compound to be refining the surface. Trying to get in there with the corner of the paper towel without hitting my fingers. Worst case scenario, make sure your hands are in a trailing position as well, like we did with the disc holder, right? Because if I put my finger against it right now, it's just going to skip off it. But if I come in here with my fingers pointing up, and it hits those grippers, it's going to kick my fingers down and you could break your fingers. So make sure that when you're polishing right now, make sure you have your fingers in a trailing position. So you can hear my fingers just kind of hitting those a little bit. Because they're trailing, they're just kind of skipping off the surface. And fortunately, they're a rounded head screw. so they're not going to do too much damage to you. A fair amount of pressure here, refining the surface, melting that wax. And then now let's go ahead and remove all the excess wax before we switch to our finer grit. I'm just going to go in here and wipe in between the grippers and get rid of some of that extra wax out of the way. The beeswax does smell really good though. I do like beeswax. A lot of guys use beeswax as a final finish. Me personally, I don't use it anymore just because it's not durable long term, and I've had to refinish a lot of pieces I finished with beeswax originally. It just doesn't really hold up over time, so if you like it, cool. I prefer something a little more durable, but to each their own. This is the microfine Yorkshire grit. Really enhances the surface. The nice thing about it being white is it doesn't discolor woods. You do want to be careful if you're working with an open pored dark wood, say Wenge for example. You never really want to buff that with white diamond, and I probably wouldn't use this on it just because it'll go into the bottom of those open pores and it'll just be white wax and it'll act almost as like a liming wax. So there's so many different woods out there and they all have their own little special considerations, so you do have to adapt and improvise a little bit. Fair amount of heat, pressure, friction. If I was going to wood burn my name on this, I would have done that before I threw the wax on, just as a heads up, because I don't really like wood burning through the wax personally. Go ahead and get a clean piece of paper towel. And let's see what kind of surface this left behind. It's gorgeous, so we can see the chatoyancy now in the piece. And this is just with the polishing paste. There isn't even any finish on it. So we got a nice clean foot, nice detail. We blended the exterior rim and where we turned the base of the bowl. Really good curve now. Let's go ahead and take this out of the chuck and we can show you guys exactly what we've got here. Go ahead and loosen these grippers up. Fortunately, these have a knurled nut on the backside and you don't have to have Allen keys. There's a lot of different cold jaw type or reverse chucking jaws. You have the cold jaws, you have the Vic Mark has their own adjusted jaws, One Way has a set. I use the Longworth for one particular reason. Let me show you. The nice thing about it is it's its own separate, I really tighten this down. It's its own separate systems to where I don't have to take up an entire chuck and mount them on the jaws to where it's more permanent. This is a really good temporary solution that just mounts in the dovetail. Get rid of all the dust, but that is our bowl. So this is very much a Glenn Lucas profile. He's got a really good curve on his with the rim profile as well. I love his shape in particular, but that is our bowl with some easy wood tools. As far as my final finish on this piece, honestly, I could leave it as is. It looks really good and it's going to be fairly durable as it is, but I'll be putting a Waterlox finish on top of this. That's what I did on this piece. It doesn't look as great right now just because there's so much dust on it, but the Waterlox is going to cut through the wax on the surface because of all the solvents in the Waterlox, and it'll penetrate deep into the wood fibers and give me a more durable finish long term. I'll let this sit with the Waterlox for about a month or two before I put food in it, just to make sure all the drying agents and all not all the toxic stuff gets evaporated and out of the wood. So I'll finish it with the Waterlox, but from here, a few coats of that and this piece is all done. If you guys have any questions or if I wasn't clear on anything in the video, go ahead and drop a comment. I'll reply to the comments myself. Also, if you have any ideas for projects you want to see me turn, go ahead and drop those in the comments below as well. And if you turn a bowl using your Easy Wood tools, or you just turn a bowl and you want to show it off, tag us on social media on Instagram, and we'll go ahead and repost that as well. So get out there, get to the lathe, have some fun. The 600 grit, could you grab that?